Rough Cuts, Adam Stanchek here. I want to see if I can do an unedited video game review this Thursday. But my favorite video game of all time. The back of it. Final Fantasy III for the Super Nintendo. Focus. I mentioned it last week in my fighting games rant, which I would do a little flashback thing, except for this is unedited. It's not a fighting game, but it's my favorite game of all time. It's a role-playing game, turn-based. So I don't know if anybody knows what an RPG is, if anybody's into video games. But it's basically where you have your characters you control, you have your sets of moves you can choose, you pick them out, and then when it's your turn, you do them. And then you have stats based like your attack, your speed, and all that stuff. And if you're faster, you can attack more frequently. Sounds like a pretty boring format for a video game. When I was a kid, I thought it was too. I rented the first Final Fantasy game that I played was Final Fantasy II for the Super Nintendo, which was Final Fantasy IV if you are Japanese. And just based off of the box art. And there's a lot of reading involved in these old Final Fantasy games, and it was a pretty big endeavor. But I ended up falling in love with the genre, and it reminded me of actually my real first role-playing game, which was Dragon Warrior, which I believe is now the Dragon Quest games, where there's a slime. Back in the Dragon Warrior, you would just have a picture of the enemy appear up in the woods, and it'd be like, I'm a monster. And then you'd be like, what do you want to do? Do you want to fight? Do you want to run? Do you want to use an item? Do you want to use a spell? But in Final Fantasy games, you actually have multiple characters you can choose from, and you can see them actually. There's battle animations. You can see them do the attacks. Pokemon is also a role-playing game. And honestly, Final Fantasy is probably what got me into Pokemon. Final Fantasy II was so good, but I never owned it. And then I always had subscriptions to video games magazines, and I saw that Final Fantasy III was coming out, and I was so pumped. It's an epic game. At the end of it, you have control of like 24 characters. You can choose to put your party in. I mean, that might be an exaggeration, but there's like a lot of characters. And each character has their own different class, so there's one person who could be better, faster at, attacks, and one person who's stronger, and they all have the different moves they can do, like special whatever move that this person, like move set that this person can learn. And so there's a huge variety in the characters in Final Fantasy III, although not as much as what they wanted when they made the game. For instance, there were some broken stats like evade and magic evade, and I'm not going to get too crazy into that because I'm already nerding out as it is. But overall, the game was epic. The music was amazing by Uematsu, if you guys know anything about video game composers. But just a very emotional, great storyline. Basically, you start out as like this girl who you're like attacking a city in a big robot armor with these two guys who are soldiers. And you don't really know what's going on, like why are you attacking it. It turns out that you're being brain controlled and that you're some kind of wizard chick. And then you go through this plot line, this resistance group who's fighting like the evil government. They send out this dude named Locke, who is a treasure hunter, who saves you and basically takes you on your journey. And you go and meet a bunch of people, and it's awesome. And one of my favorite things about that game is halfway through it, you have a big climax where you're like, this is the end of the game. But it's not, because it's only halfway through it. And then everything changes, and you have to go and rebuild everything again. And it's awesome. I recommend anybody who has a Super Nintendo to find this actual cartridge. I mean, there's emulators and all that stuff, and you can play Final Fantasy. And I think you can download it on stuff. I don't know if it's actually on the Wii. It should be. No, I bet it's not. It wasn't re-released really for anything. After this was technically Final Fantasy VI in Japan. And after this came out, the world went insane. And Squaresoft, the maker of the game, stopped making games. They made Super Mario RPG, which is another one I could talk about forever. And then after that, Chrono Trigger came out after this too, and that's another great game. But then they branched off and they didn't make Nintendo games anymore. They made Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation, which I never had as a kid. A lot of people think Final Fantasy VII is the best Final Fantasy game of all time. I maybe would say that if this game wasn't so amazing, and if I never actually had Final Fantasy VII, I have it right now on the PlayStation 3 downloaded. I haven't even played through the whole thing. It's great. There's a lot of great mechanic upgrades. But a lot of the fundamentals from Final Fantasy VII are from this game, like where they call them espers in this game, and they're like these monster creatures that you get their powers and you equip it and you learn the skills from having their abilities. In Final Fantasy VII, they call it materia, and you can attach it to your weapons. You still learn the spells from having it, but then also like you can have like these combined stuff. The materia system in Final Fantasy VII is pretty awesome. But the espers is really awesome in this game too. And then you can summon them for, like, they do a summon attack, which actually reminds me of something that was in Final Fantasy II for the Super Nintendo. But there was a certain class of warrior called the Summoners, the Callers, and they could summon a monster and do the big epic monster attack. Final Fantasy VII brought it to a degree where they could do these crazy hits where it's like Final Fantasy IV, the most damage you can do is 4 9s, 9 and a 9. Final Fantasy VI, I meant, which is Final Fantasy III. I'm getting crazy. But Final Fantasy III, we'll call it my American name of it. 999, your typical RPG, the most you can do. But in Final Fantasy VII, they brought this the thing where you would do that 4 9s like countless amount of times and do crazy epic damage. And now since then, remakes of some of the older Final Fantasy games and in current stuff, they've like, well, we're gonna have it so there is no limit, or we're gonna raise the limit to 99999, and it's like crazy. And I'm playing Borderlands 2 right now, and the amount of damage you can do in that game is just bizarre if you compare it to any of the old classic role-playing games, because then you see so many 9s up on the screen, you're like, what did I just do? That was an insane amount of damage. Final Fantasy III was such an important game to me, and I feel like it's such an important game to the universe, that if you've not played it, if you're younger, or if you're not into role-playing games or whatever, I'd say if you're gonna play one role-playing game, play Final Fantasy III. That little dude there, focus, his name is Mog, and he's a Moogle, and he dances. That's all you need to know. Epic game, get it now. How do I turn this mofo off?